Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today, since we're about to go into October, which is the month of Halloween, I thought I would do kind of just a little bit of an overview on the current state of horror as a genre in terms of its relation to film. Um, and kind of where it's gone and maybe why it's at the place it is now. Because it's a thing with horror where horror has been a main staple in the film industry for many years, up until kind of around the year 2000, I'd probably say, maybe a little bit after. Because you had great horror movies in the silent era. You had stuff like the Phantom of the Opera with not Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney Sr. You had and he was kind of the big actor then at the time. Then you went into the 30s and the 40s. You had the Universal monster films, which were our instant classics with the Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein. Then up through the 50s, you had all those atomic monster movies. You had stuff like Them or Attack of the 50-Foot Woman or the Blob and stuff like that. Going through the 60s, you got a little bit edgier and stuff like that, to the point where you're getting in the 70s where you get stuff like The Exorcist and Black Christmas, and near the end of the 70s you had Halloween, and then the 80s are just owned by slasher movies for the most part. They just own the venue. And then the 90s, you had a little bit of the slasher stuff, but a lot of it just kind of weaned off, and horror never really came back. And that's kind of sad, considering that horror is really one of my favorite genres, if not my favorite, because there's so much, there's so much good and bad in horror, but it's usually always entertaining, at least for me anyway. But I think that if you look at kind of the ups and downs of horror over the years, you'll kind of see that for whatever reason, Hollywood just kind of gave up on it. Like, the slasher boom was in the 80s, and it went into the early 90s a little bit and kind of stretched out with certain franchises. You saw stuff like Scream in the mid to late 90s, which had gone to a point where it was almost like a meta franchise where, slashers have now kind of crossed over into what was reality at the time. And really the only kind of resurgence you have recently is like the stuff like the Sinister films, the Conjuring movies. Halloween's had a little bit of a resurgence, but a lot of supernatural stuff is really what kind of creeps in nowadays. They've kind of gone away from the slashers for the most part, but they milked those things dry to the point where it essentially, again, even though I really love slashers, the slasher movie essentially bankrupted the horror genre for a number of years after its initial failure, because there really wasn't. When you look at trends in horror, you go from monster movies to like the atomic, giant monster movies, to the experimental stuff, to the slasher, to supernatural and things like that. You know, it feels like people don't want to put enough effort into horror movies anymore. They just want something that's low budget. And when I say people, I mean studios. They just want something that's low budget, that they can make on a shoestring budget, and that'll make its money back, basically, or that'll make somewhat of a profit. They don't care about necessarily making a good product. And again, I kind of find that out from the slasher genre as well, because slashers were notorious for having, shoestring budgets, horrible low budgets. You get the worst actors you can find, or the cheapest actors you can find, I should say, which sometimes happen to be the worst. And then you make a movie, and it makes like $5 million, but you made it for about $500,000. So it's a profit, and that's why slasher movies were put out so frequently in the 80s, is because everybody wanted to do this because it was such an easy cash in. And unfortunately, I think that led to people becoming a lot lazier when it came to horror movies. And I think you can see the epitome of that was something like the Blair Witch Project from 1999. I think it was 99 that was made. And it was literally, I think it was a movie that was made for about $26,000, and it made 50 or 60 million, something ridiculous like that. And it was a movie that again, you've delved even lower into the low budget, which is the found footage genre of horror, which then became a mainstay because then you had Paranormal Activity, which was successful, and that spawned a bunch of sequels. And you had a bunch of people that just said like, "Hey, I can go out and I can film myself with my camcorder, or I can film like my friends with my camcorder in the woods, and I can be a millionaire." Which again is ridiculous, but whenever you have a movie like that that is successful, there are always going to be imitators. And again, that happened with the slasher genre and stuff too. But you had some really creative ones. In terms of the stuff that was spawned from, like, again, everybody attributes it back to Halloween, which is the spawning of the slasher film, which was which spawned stuff like Friday the 13th. It spawned stuff like eventually Nightmare on Elm Street, even though that was a very different animal. It still kind of fell into that slasher genre. Without Halloween, I don't think you would have had those films. But it also spawned a whole lot of crap movies that were just blatant ripoffs. And even Friday the 13th spawned its own ripoffs. You look at stuff like The Burning, even though I actually enjoy that movie, it's very obviously a cheap ripoff of Friday the 13th, where you just have a deformed killer running around murdering people. But I think that the slasher movie is what eventually led to Hollywood not committing a serious budget to horror films, and as a direct result, because they weren't finding people that were creative and they weren't innovative in the genre, it ultimately killed it for a number of years. And it's starting to have a little bit of a resurgence now, again, but not very much so. It's nothing compared to what it was, before the 80s. And you really have to kind of dissect what exactly the movies were before you had stuff like Halloween and Friday the 13th. And again, slashers were always kind of low budget. You get that, but you look at a movie like The Exorcist. You look at the special effects in that film that were done at the time, and they're amazing special effects. Even today, really, a lot of them are very good special effects. The stuff where it happens in the room, they filmed it in a meat freezer, so you can see their breath and stuff like that. That because they're actually in a frozen room. Obviously they couldn't add that stuff in with CGI back then; it didn't exist. Or the stuff with the pea soup, the makeup that's on Reagan, the little girl that's played by Linda Blair. It's such great special effects in that movie, and it's actually the last. I believe it's maybe recently that's changed, but I believe that was the last movie to take home horror film to take home an Oscar. And it's sad that that's the case. Because I think that there's a lot of horror should be a more respected genre than what it is. Again, it's been written off because of the low budgetness and because of the lack of respect that it gets from studios these days. And again, I'm not necessarily knocking slasher movies in general. I'm just saying I feel like they set a precedent that then became the norm, and that became a problem. Because they weren't willing to experiment with ideas. And again, there's a lot of really good horror movies from the 80s that I do like. You look at stuff like The Shining, The Changeling. I don't know why certain other ones aren't coming to mind, but even films that I think that really are in reality horror that aren't necessarily lumped into that category. Stuff like Alien. Alien in 1979, that was extremely innovative, and really that's a horror movie. That's not that. I mean, it has science fiction elements, but in reality, it's a horror movie. These people are being stalked by a monster through a ship that's slowly picking them off and murdering them one by one. It's a horror movie. Aliens, the sequel, is a bit more of an action film, but the original in '79 is a horror movie at its core, and that's how certain things work. But most of the time, people always attribute that as a science fiction film because of the setting and everything like that. But really, it's horror. But we don't see innovation like that anymore to a lot of extents. I've seen a couple of things over the course of a few years. I mean, again, the found footage genre spawned stuff like Cloverfield, which honestly I don't really care that much for Cloverfield. I think it's kind of a piece of shit. I haven't really seen the sequels to it either. Again, it's just it's taking the found footage genre and giving it a budget, which I don't think adds too much because then you just have a crappy camera guy running around and you don't see half the stuff. You know, not to say that you need to film horror in hard lighting. Shadows are very effective, but when you're running around, it's like watching an entire movie that's been done on shaky cam. It's kind of shitty. And certain stuff I understand, like, okay, maybe certain things don't work as much as they used to. We've seen a lot of parodies and stuff of things that you saw in, like, back in the 50s. You look at movies like Eight-Legged Freaks with David Arquette, where, it's very obviously a joke on, movies like Them or Tarantula, stuff from back in the 50s that were like atomic energy caused these insects to grow to massive sizes and they start killing people and doing stuff. But, you know, you can still do stuff nowadays. There's not that many people that are dedicated to horror. When you think of the great horror directors, you think of the Carpenters and the Cravens. They're not. There's no modern director that's dedicated themselves to horror, and I think that's another problem. Is that there's a lot of people nowadays that don't. They spread themselves over multiple genres, and not to say that's a bad thing because it's been done by many great directors. You can look at Spielberg and Kubrick for that, but I think that the problem that you run into is that when you have people that aren't as in love with the genre as they should be, but I think that is a problem when you don't have people that are dedicated to the genre or people that enjoy the genre to an extent that they want to stay in it. It feels almost like something that it feels almost like a rite of passage of a young director. It's like, oh, I got to go make a shitty horror movie so people will notice me, and then I can go do other stuff, the stuff I really want to do. Nobody wants to stay in horror, and again, that's a bit of a problem too. Not just for directors actually, when you think about it, just for actors as well. Actors and actresses that you do different things and obviously like that, but a lot of actors and actresses got their starts as scream king and queens. You look at Jamie Lee Curtis, she was in stuff obviously like Halloween 1 and 2 and Prom Night. Then later on she went off and she branched out, but there's not a lot of actors that get their starts in horror and get known for being in horror films. You can think of back to again a lot of the early slasher films, stuff like Kevin Bacon in the first Friday the 13th, or stuff like Leonardo DiCaprio in Critters 3, which I don't even know if that really counts. You look at even older stuff than that. You look at back when horror movies actually have like decent actors in them. You look at Friday the 13th Part 4, where you had Crispin Glover and Corey Feldman and known names. Or names that would become very well known not long after that. I think that there's a distinct lack of talent in the horror genre, and when there is talent, it does show. You look at the Halloween remake where people, they had a good director, they had good effects and lighting, and they had a lot of people that really cared. And John Carpenter got re-involved in the franchise, so you had talent behind that film, and it worked. And I think that's why it worked, because when you put talent behind movies, as long as that talent meshes and the egos and stuff don't get in the way, a lot of the times you get a good product. And I think that adds to the problem too, is that you don't have people that are dedicated, and you don't have people that are talented doing a lot of these horror films. And I think that's why they turn out so shitty a lot of the time, especially nowadays, and they get glazed over so much, is because people don't care as much about horror as they used to in the entertainment industry, and it shows by what happens to it. And unfortunately, I don't know if they're ever going to get back to the places they were in the 70s and the 80s, and before kind of the drought they had through the 90s and the 2000s. But they'll say that it's because they lack the creative material, that whatever has been done has been done. If you get a creative mind, you can scare somebody. If you get a creative mind that knows how to do horror, or thinks that they have something that they can make work, then you can do it and you can scare people. Again, it's the same thing as comedy. How many jokes have been told over the course of human history? Billions upon billions upon billions of jokes have been told, and people have laughed at them. And there's new jokes coming up every single day, and people get it. And you can do the same thing with horror. And the thing is, horror and comedy are kind of two sides of the same coin. and they work a lot the same. And I think that's why the comedy genre right now is kind of tanking a bit too. It's been very light as of late. You don't see very many really good comedies come out these days. And again, I feel like it's for the same reasons as horror. But that's just my opinion on the current state of horror and maybe what could be done to kind of bring it back to the forefront and make it a strong force in the film industry again. But I want to know your opinion. Are you a huge horror fan? What's your favorite horror movie? What or your favorite horror franchise? What films do you like to watch? Are you a slasher person? Are you a psychological thriller person? Are you a monster movie person? Are you a black and white monster movie or a 1980s type of monster type of thing? Put your thoughts in the comments. Again, I like to know what you're thinking. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?